He did convince me, though, for a long time, that he had met La Llorona as a kid. Which, if you don't know, La Llorona is, I believe it's either an indigenous or a Hispanic myth about a woman crying because she lost her children. And I could be getting this wrong because my dad told me like his story of it forever ago. And apparently she drowns kids if they like come looking for her when they hear her crying. And my dad's a very good storyteller. And I remember we were getting ready for bed, and me and my sisters were like all snuggled up. We're like, Dad, tell us a story. And he was like, okay. And you would think like, oh, it's gonna be some really weird, like dumb story. Nah, dude, this guy pulled out all the stops. He's like, one time in my neighborhood, there was an old abandoned house at the end of the block. And in the old abandoned house, there was a pool out behind it. And I and my friends like to go messing around in the abandoned pool because there was no water in it. And that's what little boys do. They just like to mess around in things that they're not supposed to touch. And one day, while we were staying out a little bit past curfew, because our parents only wanted us to come home when the street lights turned on and the sun was just setting, we snuck out to the pool. And this time, the pool was under construction, which was a little weird, but we noticed like a for sale sign in the driveway. So we just thought, no biggie, they're revamping the pool, the house will be for sale, somebody will buy it, but nobody's here right now. So in the meantime, let's just play a game. Well, one of his friends, I think his friend's name was Mark, ended up finding like a really big crack in the foundation of the pool. So what does he do? He goes through the foundation of the foundation crack in the pool, and he like disappears. And he doesn't come back out for a while, and my dad and the other friend, who I think was named like Chris or something, started to get nervous. And they're like, hey, Mark, where you at? What you doing? You're making us nervous, right? Mark comes out, and he's like, guys, you're not going to believe this, but there's like a whole dirt tunnel that leads out from this like crack. And my dad and Chris are like, nah, there's no way, you're making that up, you can't scare us, blah, 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 doing the thing that boys do. And then he's like, no, seriously, like, there's a straight up dirt tunnel back there, like, you should probably, let's go check it out, like, it might lead somewhere, it's kind of cool. So Mark finally convinces my dad and Chris to, go and give it a try. And they all go through the weird little crack together. And sure enough, there's a big, long dirt tunnel on the other side. And it was dark, but there was just enough light from the sun outside that you could see. So, just to be safe, my dad's like, hey, I'll come back. Let me go get my flashlight from the house. So he goes back to my grandparents' house. He grabs a flashlight, and then he joins Chris and Mark at the pool. He goes back through to get to the tunnel. And when my dad comes back, he notices that Chris and Mark are sort of in like a little bit of a trance. And he can't really understand why. And then he hears it, and it's this lady crying. And Mark's like, hey, do you hear this lady crying? Like, it sounds like she's really upset. And Chris goes, yeah, I hear her too, but I don't know why anybody else would be down here. And Mark goes, well, maybe she got stuck. Like, let's go see if we can help her. My dad's a little bit hesitant, but he understands Mark's reasoning and is like, yeah, you know what, that's fair. I think we should go check it out, see if there's anything wrong or anything that we can help with. So together, my dad, Mark, and Chris all go farther down the dirt tunnel. And as they're walking, the crying grows louder. And as the crying gets louder, they get a little more nervous, but at this point, they're committed and they're determined. So they just keep walking. And as they walk, they start to hear the sound of water. And they're kind of confused because it wouldn't make much sense for there to be like running water in a random dirt tunnel connected to a pool in the neighborhood. But they're young boys, they don't really know what to make of it, so they kind of just follow the sound of the crying and the water. And as they get closer, they notice that there's a woman just kneeling there by what looks to be a river. And it doesn't really make sense that there's a river there, but they're so mesmerized by the woman crying that they don't really notice how weird everything is. So my dad approaches the woman, but then he stops because just something in his stomach's like, hey, that's kind of weird. Maybe I just won't bother her. But Mark's different. Mark is determined. He approaches the woman. He kind of taps her on the shoulder and is like, hey, ma'am, what's going on? How can we help you? And all of a sudden, the woman looks up, And instead of a normal human face, she's got the head of a horse. And she is sobbing. And she grabs onto Mark, like, super, super tight so that her nails bite into the skin of his arms and he starts to bleed a little bit. And Mark starts screaming, as you do when a strange lady grabs you. And all of a sudden, my dad and Chris start freaking out because the whole situation has just escalated. And they realize that this lady who's crying is now trying to push Mark down in the river and drown him. So my dad and Chris end up jumping on the lady, attacking her, trying to get Mark free. Finally, they fend her off. Mark manages to escape, and they all go hauling down the tunnel back towards the way that they came. As they're running, they can hear crying and screaming. And then, all of a sudden, this lady starts singing. And it's a really sweet-sounding sort of song. And for a second, they pause and they think, oh, well, maybe it's a different person. And Mark kind of starts to go back, and then Chris and my dad stop him, and they're like, hey, man, I have a bad feeling about this. I think it's the same person. Like, let's not worry about it. Let's just leave. We can tell an adult, and they can worry about it. Like, this is clearly not a job for us. We're just kids. Mark's like, you know what? You're right. So they go back. They get out through the tunnel, and they go back through the crack into the neighborhood. And by now the streetlights are on. They're past their curfew, so they all kind of scamper back to their houses. But they have an agreement that the next night, the next evening after school, they're all going to meet up at the pool again. So the day goes by. They kind of try not to think about it. My dad is keeping to himself for the most part. Then he, gets done with school, goes gets Chris, goes gets Mark, and together they walk to the end of the neighborhood where the pool and the abandoned house is, and the for sale sign is still there. The pool is still empty, but there's no crack. And they look to see if it had just been repaired or if it was something like that, but there is no sort of sign that the concrete had been repaired at all. There literally is just no crack in the surface of the pool. It just doesn't exist. And for a second, Mark and Chris are kind of like, well, maybe it was just a dream. And my dad's like, there's no way that all three of us had the same dream. That's just not possible. And so it kind of became a thing where they just didn't talk about it, but it was something that happened. And my dad told me this when I was like, I was 6 to 8 years old. And he told me and my sisters this late one night. And then he said, good night, love you guys. Left the room, turned the lights off, closed the door, and then expected me to be able to fall asleep that night. Needless to say, I did not.